Welcome to Futility Closet, a celebration of the quirky and the curious, the thought-provoking and the simply amusing. This is the audio companion to the website that catalogs more than 8,000 curiosities in history, language, mathematics, literature, philosophy, and art. You can find us online at futilitycloset.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to episode 61. I'm Greg Ross.
And I'm Sharon Ross. In 18th century England, wealthy landowners would sometimes hire people to live as hermits on their estates. In today's show, we'll explore this odd custom and review the job requirements for life as a poetic recluse. We'll also learn about Germany's surprising passion for an Apache hero and puzzle over some very generous bank robbers. Our podcast is partly supported by advertising, and you can help us out by taking a quick 5-minute survey to help us find the right advertisers for our show. Please go to podsurvey.com/futility to take the survey. It takes less than 5 minutes and it's completely anonymous. When you're finished, you can enter to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Longtime listeners may have taken our survey last year, but this is a new version and it will help us find the most appropriate ads for our show. Plus, you'll have another chance to win that $100 gift card. So please go to podsurvey.com/futility. That's podsurvey.com/futility to take our survey and help the show. We'll also put the link in our show notes. Thanks so much for helping to support Futility Closet.
Okay, garden hermits, sometimes known as ornamental hermits. I have to thank listener Randy Banderob for suggesting this topic. In the 1700s in England, apparently wealthy landowners would sometimes hire actual people to live as hermits for years on their estates, which is an odd practice which has almost been completely forgotten, which makes it all the more mysterious. When Randy suggested that idea to me, it rang a faint bell, and I went back through my own archives on Futility Closet and found that I had briefly written about it. I had run across an item in my own sort of desultory reading in 2008, so this is, 7 years ago, about an ad that had appeared, we think originally in the early 1770s, although the original ad has been lost, but this description of it survives. H. Hamilton, once the proprietor of Payne's Hill near Cobham, Surrey, advertised for a person who was willing to become a hermit in that beautiful retreat of his. The conditions were that he was to continue in the hermitage 7 years, where he should be provided with a Bible, optical glasses, a mat for his bed, a hassock for his pillow, an hourglass for his timepiece, water for his beverage, food from the house, but never to exchange a syllable with the servant. He was to wear a camlet robe, that's a woolen robe, never to cut his beard or nails, nor ever to stray beyond the limits of the grounds. If he lived there under all these restrictions till the end of the term, he was to receive 700 guineas. But on breach of any of them, or if he quitted the place any time previous to that term, the whole was to be forfeited. One person attempted it, but a 3 weeks trial cured him. So he signed up for 7 years and lasted 3 weeks. But that's apparently a real thing that happened there. The ad was actually placed and fulfilled, however briefly, and the whole offer was a real thing that someone could come and live on an estate as a hermit.
So landowners wanted someone to come and be unwashed and unshaved and just live like a wild man on their premises
for some time.
What, romantic reasons? Picturesque reasons?
This has all been lost, but there was sort of an aesthetic movement in Georgian England called melancholy, which has been entirely forgotten now, which is sort of the one thing that people today might remember that was sort of part of that. The most famous one is Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, where the poet is just sort of looking sadly at a graveyard and ruminating on the fleeting, transitory nature of life and sort of thinking deep, sad, noble thoughts. And that's all. Today, the world is spinning so fast that it's just even contemplating doing that is just completely out of the question. But that's where all this comes from, is not only would you be disposed toward reflecting nobly about life in that way yourself, but if you were rich enough, you could hire someone to act as a living symbol of that in your garden. So
you wouldn't have to live like the hermit yourself. You could just hire someone to do that for you.
Basically,
to
yes.
show how refined you were.
It sounds odd now, and it's hard even to put yourself in those shoes, but that's basically what this was.
Okay.
I guess you'd have to say the world authority on this now is a man named Gordon Campbell, who teaches Renaissance studies at the University of Leicester. He published a book, which I recommend, in 2013 called The Hermit in the Garden, which is basically about where this came from and what it was and basically what it sort of devolved into. The whole thing, I think, is fascinating, and he's a fine writer. Basically, the hermits were encouraged to live on the estates of wealthy landowners in the Georgian period, which is between George I and the death of George IV, so very roughly the 1700s. In England mostly, but there are also a few of these in Scotland and Ireland, and less frequently in continental Europe. Basically, it started out with English country landowners would commission architectural follies, which are odd or unusual buildings on their estates. Many of those included hermitages, and they filled those with, at first, imaginary hermits, and then gradually sort of graduated to actual real live hermits. These weren't religious figures, I should say. They were secular, just what you think of today as a hermit, sort of just someone who's retreated from society into a life of, I guess you'd say, contemplation. Some of the landowners provided for an actual occupant who was given a hut or a grotto and a few meals a day, and they just put him in a picturesque corner of the property and he'd live there. The typical term was 7 years, which is quite a long time.
That is quite a long time.
I don't know how they settled on 7. The hermits would be encouraged to dress like druids. This is sort of what I had pictured in my head before I even had started learning about this. It's exactly the way I pictured it. It turns out to be accurate. And they were typically required to refrain from cutting their hair or washing. I guess because that's sort of part of the ideal of what you want a hermit to look like. Although after 7 years, I'm not sure what that would you want to get too close to the guy. And they'd live permanently on these estates, so they'd be fed, cared for, and consulted occasionally for advice or viewed for entertainment. But the whole conceit behind this wasn't humorous or facetious. This was taken seriously as sort of a poetic or noble expression of fine sensibility, like we were talking about. A sort of fine sensibility, one keen to the spiritual benefits of privacy, peace, and mild woe. That whole thing has gone by, too. Gardens in general, with or without hermits, used to be thought of as places of somewhat retreat or contemplation, and we've still got a bit of that now, but again, life is so busy now that I think even that's starting to fade away. But that's part of the same spirit of this whole enterprise, I guess you'd call it.
So you'd go sit in your garden to contemplate, knowing that there was this dirty, wretched, your hermit a few hundred yards away in his little hovel, right, contemplating too.
And it's funny how this thing evolved, because it has its antecedents that Campbell goes through in the book, but basically the appearance of these hermits, this movement, at first there was no hermit, there would just be a hut, and then they'd leave these sort of props lying around as if there was a hermit and he just stepped away for a moment when you happened to show up. So they'd lay out a table with a chair and reading glasses and a classical text to suggest that he had been there and has just stepped away for a second. But then later they sort of stepped up to actually employing actual people. And in some cases they'd be asked just to stay entirely apart from any human interaction, even with the servants who fed them. But in others, occasionally, if you had, say, house guests, you'd bring them down triumphantly to visit
your
them,
hermit.
And he would look wise and sad and answer questions or serve wine or something. Sort of depends on the deal you'd set up. Some of the little evidence that's come down to us about any of this, because the actual hermits are long gone and most of the hermitages are as well, are the advertisements and sort of the commerce end of it, where a landowner had to find a hermit, or in a few rare cases, some poor young man would try to appeal to get a job like this of a landowner, which is interesting in either way. So here are a few examples from Campbell's book of just descriptions that survive. The first one, this was published in 1924 by Osbert Sitwell. It's not clear which house is specified here, but this seems to be an accurate account. At one great house in England, the accounts disclose a half-yearly payment of £300 to a hermit who had, for this commensurate salary, to remain bearded and in a state of picturesque dirtiness for 6 months in the year in an artificial cave at a suitable distance from the house. Just far enough, but not too far, for the fashionable house party, with its court of subservient poets and painters, to visit, walking there in the afternoons, peering into the semi-darkness with a little thrill of wonder and excitement. But that captures what we're talking about, that they're just trying to inform the sensibility. You could go visit this guy and sort of partake in the spirit of the whole thing.
But if people were advertising for them, then I guess if you were one of these house guests, you would either have to pretend that you didn't know this guy was just playing a part, or maybe you would be unaware. Maybe you weren't aware that they'd hired it for your entertainment.
Or you might be. I mean, it's just, he's sort of an actor playing a part, but everyone buys into that just to sort of participate in the spirit of the thing.
Yeah.
And if the hermit played his part well, which apparently some of them did, it wasn't hard to sort of suspend your disbelief. There's another advertisement referenced in Sir William Gell's A Tour in the Lakes, made in 1797, that reads, "The hermit is never to leave the place or hold conversation with anyone for 7 years, during which he is neither to wash himself or cleanse himself in any way whatever, but is to let his hair and nails, both on hands and feet, grow as long as nature will permit them." And presumably someone fulfilled that, at least part of it as well. I can't decide myself how hard a job this would be. Part of it sounds kind of appealing, that you just get to withdraw and read books and think wise thoughts all day. But if people are dropping out after 3 weeks, I'm probably pretty sure I would change my tune pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think after like 24 hours, you'd be really bored.
Some of the other hermits were asked to refrain from wearing shoes, or they would, as I said, sometimes entertain guests. They'd give personalized poetry readings when asked, or sometimes serve wine. It all came down to what the landowner wanted them to do. There's one particularly interesting one at the Hawkstone estate in Shropshire, which belonged to Sir Richard Hill. This is from a guide that was written in 1784. "You pull a bell and gain admittance. The hermit is generally in a sitting posture, with a table before him, on which is a skull, the emblem of mortality, an hourglass, a book, and a pair of spectacles. The venerable barefooted father, whose name is Francis, if awake, always rises up at the approach of strangers. He seems about 90 years of age, yet has all his sense of admiration. He is tolerably conversant and far from being unpolite." That's interesting in itself, but what's even more interesting is a few years later, apparently Francis died, and they replaced him with an automaton that did pretty much the same thing. Sir Richard Colt Hoare visited Hawkstone in 1801, and he describes a hill on which there is, quote, "a building wherein is the figure of a hermit who moves and speaks. The face is natural enough, the figure stiff and not well managed." And then in the same year, Thomas Martin actually visited and went inside to interact with this. It's basically a puppet, I guess you'd call it, of a hermit, a full-sized, I guess, effigy that would interact and speak, which is kind of impressive given it's 1801. Martin's description runs like this. "We were now conducted to the hermit's cell, which is certainly the best representation of what the poets describe that I ever saw. You ring a bell, and the door immediately opens of itself and discovers a venerable, barefooted old man seated in a recess with a table before him, on which is a skull, an hourglass, a book, and a pair of spectacles. He rises as you approach and bows. On your putting questions to him, his lips move, and he answers in a hoarse, hollow voice, coughs as if almost exhausted. He told us that he was 100 years of age, and that he had resided there the greatest part of his life. Over the recess was memento mori, which is a Latin phrase meaning remember that you must die, in large letters, but there being some other lines which I could not make out for want of light, he was asked if he could repeat them, and he expressed himself as follows," and reads this little verse. "Far from the busy scenes of life, far from the world, its cares and strife, in solitude more pleased to dwell, the hermit bids you to his cell, warns you sin's gilded baits to fly, and calls you to prepare to die." Martin's description continues, "The deception is admirable. The gardener, who is invisible, must be the actor, and an admirable one he is. The naked feet are well carved, and so is the face, for although the eyes and lips move and the figure rises, it is certainly a mere automaton. Over the door is written Procul o procul esti profani, which is a quotation from the Aeneid that means keep away, O uninitiated ones." So that one graduated from, or descended, I guess you'd say, from an actual human hermit to sort of a puppet that was operated by the gardener. I guess it was just an additional duty that he had.
We went from imaginary hermits to real pretend hermits
to stuffed hermits.
Yeah.
Which is how these things, I understand, that's generally the progression, generally in England, that's how this whole thing went. They started out with imaginary ones, and then as the things started to fade, they would just resort back to stuffed figures, which is just as strange from our perspective, but makes a certain amount of sense. It's interesting what this finally devolved into. It was all over shortly after 1800. It kind of just, this whole interest in melancholy kind of faded away with the advent of, I guess, the Industrial Revolution. But one of the reasons it died was the advent of abolitionism, a movement for the abolishment of slavery, because this wasn't outright slavery, but it was sort of the same objection could be made where someone just owns your life entirely and can tell you how to live it.
Yeah, well, it sounds like an indentured servant, because my understanding is those terms were usually 7 years. I was wondering if that's where the 7 years came from.
For all I know, it was.
So it's like similar to an indentured servant.
I thought that was an interesting objection.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, one thing that remains from this, we don't have hermits anymore, but they sort of devolved through these stuffed figures into figures that were just kept in the garden. And now, Campbell says, one of the remnants that we have still today is garden gnomes, which sort of descended from the whole thing.
Oh, really?
I mean, garden gnomes have other antecedents, but it's one of the few vestiges of that whole thing, which I thought was interesting. I mean, it's as strange as it sounds to have a hermit in your garden today. Someday people will look back on the fact that we have these artificial figures that we put in our gardens and no one thinks is strange, and someday that's going to seem very strange indeed. Anyway, if anyone is interested in hiring me as a hermit, I'm willing to give it a shot. It still sounds like it might be at least interesting.
Yeah, especially if you get all the books you want to read.
That's right.
Our podcast is supported by our phenomenal patrons. Greg and I spend many hours a week researching and creating each episode, and we need your help to keep making the show. So if you enjoy Futility Closet and want to help keep it going, then check out our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/futilitycloset. You can pledge any amount that you choose, and if you pledge at least $1 an episode, you get access to the podcast activity feed, where you can read our behind-the-scenes comments, listen to outtakes, and extra lateral thinking puzzles. Thanks so much to everyone who has contributed so far. We really appreciate every donation we get.
In listener mail this week, we got several listeners directed us to an article on the Somerton Man that appeared in the California Sunday magazine last week. The Somerton Man is an unidentified corpse that was discovered on a South Australian beach in December 1948. We covered the whole story in our episode 25 if you want to hear the whole thing. I also heard from Derek Abbott, who's a physicist at the University of Adelaide, who's one of the leading modern investigators in the case, and he started a campaign on Indiegogo to fund a serious effort to identify the man. He says, "We are continuing to solve the case and will produce informational videos and perform historical searches, DNA tests, and isotope tests." The whole thing is getting very interesting. They're inferring some genetic information based on the Somerton Man's descendants, and it looks like the Somerton Man may have been American, perhaps from Virginia, and there are some links to Thomas Jefferson's family tree. What they really want to do is exhume the Somerton Man's body to extract some autosomal DNA. So far, that's been opposed by the Attorney General of South Australia, who says there needs to be public interest reasons that go well beyond public curiosity or broad scientific interest, but there's now an online petition to try to get him to change his mind. If they can get the autosomal DNA, then they can start using genealogical databases, which gives them a lot more firepower in just identifying who this man was. If you're interested in any of these things, I'll put links to all of it in the show notes.
In episode 47, Greg told us about travel books that were written by Victorian author Favell Lee Mortimer, who had very negative things to say about many other countries. And on that subject, Hano Sola wrote in to say, "On the podcast, you reported about an author who wrote a series of mean books about the peculiar traits of other countries that she never visited. Well, there is a similar author in Germany. Karl May wrote several adventure and travel books about places he never went to. His most influential series is about Winnetou, the heroic, noble, and pacifist chief of a Native American tribe. He befriends Old Shatterhand, a German-born immigrant to America in the Wild West era, who works as a trapper and surveyor for a railroad company. It's a romanticized version of the struggles between immigrant Europeans and Native Americans in the Wild West. Both Winnetou and Old Shatterhand are depicted as outsiders who try to work towards peace between warring tribes and hateful immigrants." And Greg and I found this all very interesting, especially as we had never heard of Karl May. I looked into it and learned that Karl May is one of the best-selling German authors of all time. His books have sold more than 100 million copies.
That's astounding.
Yeah, and most Americans have never heard of him, but apparently almost all German adults know of Karl May and his most famous and very beloved characters of Winnetou and Old Shatterhand. So he's actually writing about America and completely known in Germany and almost completely unknown in America.
And beloved, yeah.
May's books on Winnetou were written mostly in the late 1800s and were beloved by Kaiser Wilhelm II, Albert Einstein and Albert Schweitzer, Franz Kafka, and Hitler. They were adapted into an extremely successful series of movies in the 1960s, which regenerated their popularity. And according to Rivka Galchen, who wrote an article on Mai's popularity in Germany for the New Yorker magazine, in 2002, in a copyright case before the German Federal High Court, it was held that Winnetou was no longer a mere character in a novel. He had become the name for a certain human type, that of the noble Indian chief. Michael Kimmelman, writing for Spiegel International, said, "To Germans, Winnetou is like Paul Bunyan, Abe Lincoln, and Elvis rolled into one."
That's like as American as you can get. It's just astounding that generally Americans haven't heard of him.
Yeah. Hanno wrote, "From a personal perspective, I cannot stress how influential Karl May is here in Germany. Everybody, and I mean everybody of my age knows Winnetou. His stories are the basis for much of what Germans think they know about the Wild West. I'm born in the early 70s. I never read his books, but when I was young, the Winnetou movie adaptations, with its maddening earworm of a theme song, were on German TV all the time. We didn't play Cowboys and Indians, we played Old Shatterhand and Winnetou." This is all the more interesting because Karl May never actually visited the U.S. until much later in his career after writing most of the Winnetou books, and even then he didn't get any further west than Buffalo, New York.
But still wrote well enough, or convincingly enough about it to sell 100 million books.
Exactly. May was born in 1842, the fifth of 14 children, into a rather poor family. He later claimed that he'd been blind until the age of 6 when he was mysteriously cured. He was kicked out of school for stealing and served several jail terms for stealing and other crimes, including pretending to be an American ambassador. He began writing in his 30s, mostly crime stories, romances, and travel tales. He often wrote using a pseudonym, which allowed him to publish and then get paid for the same story, published in different magazines under different titles. In 1893, at age 51, May published his first Winnetou and Old Shatterhand novel, and this proved to be his big break. The Winnetou novels were written with Old Shatterhand being the first-person narrator of the stories. Winnetou calls Old Shatterhand Charlie, or the German approximation of Charlie, a nickname of Karl, which was May's first name.
So he's sort of that's interesting.
It's like his alter ego. Many readers in May's time thought that May actually was Old Shatterhand, and May helped this confusion along by commissioning a gunsmith to make him 2 distinctive rifles that were described in the novels, by often wearing a fringed leather frontiersman jacket and wide-brimmed felt hat and a necklace made out of bear teeth, and by claiming that he could understand more than 1,200 languages and dialects. Eventually, he went so far as to specifically say that he really was Old Shatterhand and had experienced everything in his stories. Galchen notes that after May became famous when actual American Indians came through Germany in Wild West shows, May not only avoided them, but defamed them as outcasts from their tribe who played vile, lying roles. And that's because meeting with these Indians could have proved troublesome for May, especially if he didn't speak their language as he claimed he could.
But he still wrote, I keep coming back to that, he still convinced millions and millions of people. I don't know, the whole thing's interesting.
Despite his successes, May had many difficulties in his later life. His marriage fell apart, and he had difficulties getting royalty payments for some of his earlier works. He was attacked for having written articles for Catholic magazines, despite being a Protestant, for having tried to cover up his criminal history, and for having lied about what places he'd actually been to. Galchen says that May never escaped financial and reputation problems, and a lot of his money ended up going to lawyers, and his last years were spent trying to defend his integrity. But none of this seems to have had much impact on May's popularity in Germany. May's continuing legacy there is evident in the much-visited Karl May Museum, and in the extremely popular Karl May festivals that still continue to this day. Many German and Austrian towns host such festivals, but the largest is in Bad Segeberg, Germany, which is visited each summer by 300,000 people.
And this is more than 100 years after he wrote it.
Exactly. At the festival grounds, you can find faux log cabins with signs such as Pony Express, Sheriff's Office, and Saloon. as well as teepees and places where you can pretend to pan for gold. You can buy toy guns and tomahawks and feathered headdresses, as well as all of Karl May's writings, including the distinctive volumes printed by the century-old press that prints only books by and about May. I mean, that's how popular he is. He has his own press. And as you say, more than 100 years after the original printings. The main attraction at the festival is the amphitheater, where they stage the Winnetou and Old Shatterhand stories. And they stage them complete with live horses and chickens, gunfights, and flaming spear fights, staged for the thousands of children in the audience dressed in face paint and feathers.
That sounds so American. It sounds like this ought to be wildly popular here. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, what I was reading was that, to Germans, this is so exotic. The American Wild West is so exotic.
And here it is.
Yeah. If his books had been set, I read one person who said if his books had been set on another planet, they probably would have been more popular in America. But yeah, because it just strikes the Germans as just so different than anything that they've got in their country. For decades, most of Germans' knowledge about the Western U.S. came from the Winnetou stories, particularly in East Germany, where travel was very restricted. Hanno says, today, his cultural meaning is fading fast, now that the history of the Wild West is much better explored and people actually listen to Native Americans when they call out racist depictions of their heritage. While May's writing, as I understand it, was fairly positive, it's also highly inaccurate and received lots of criticism from U.S. Native American interest groups who were bewildered to find Germans dressing up as Native Americans based on an invented character. May's fans in Germany today are often inspired to learn more about Native American history and cultures, often with the goal of correcting May's inaccuracies. So many of his fans can carefully explain why, for example, although Winnetou is an Apache, his characteristics really suggest those of a Sioux. Galchen says part of being a Karl May fan, it seems, is correcting Karl May. She goes on to make the sad but true point that Karl May fans enjoy discussing his inaccuracies because of their extensive knowledge of the actual history of American Indians, whereas most Americans know almost nothing on the subject, which is a really good point. Although May is primarily remembered for his Winnetou novels, he did write many other works, including a successful series set in the Ottoman Empire, whose narrator-protagonist's name was Kara ben Nemsi, which translates to Karl, son of Germans, and which May also claimed as his own experiences. So apparently he traveled extensively in the American Wild West and the Ottoman Empire, and there's even a series of travel books set in Africa, which apparently he did too. Rivka Galchen says, in his autobiography, he cites two books as having been most influential in his life. One was a collection of folk tales that his grandmother read to him. The other was a tale of a split soul given to him by a good priest while he was in prison. Neither book exists, it turns out, though both almost certainly were big influences on him.
That's the other odd thing about that story is that there's so much deception in his life.
Yeah, he spent a lot of his life apparently confabulating and perpetrating frauds, and it's interesting. But, I mean, people just love him in Germany, just love his writings. And
this world he created seems to resonate as so true to people that has lasted all these years.
Yeah, and I mean, he did do research. He based apparently a lot of his writings on James Fenimore Cooper, who had written earlier in the 19th century and had been very popular. And he, looked at maps and read travel books that he could find. And apparently it's accurate enough, at least in some places, that I found forums on the internet where his fans were passionately defending him, saying, he couldn't have known this detail or that detail. He must have been to America and it just wasn't documented. Like, he must have had this trip. Where he had seen these things, but I don't know. Then again, there are a number of inaccuracies too. So apparently he had a very good imagination.
That whole story is just fascinating.
So thanks so much to Hanno and everyone else who writes into us. And if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to us at podcast@futilitycloset.com. So, time for a lateral thinking puzzle. Greg's on the hot seat, so he's already nervously laughing. I'm going to give him an odd-sounding situation, and he's going to have to try to deduce what's actually going on, asking only yes or no questions. This puzzle comes from Edward Harshman's Fantastic Lateral Thinking Puzzles. So it should be promising. Fantastic. Here's your puzzle. Muggsy and Butch hunched over a table in a dingy basement. They drew floor plans of a bank and sketched its burglar alarm. They heard a car approach. Butch got up, looked out the dirty window, and recognized the car as belonging to an off-duty police officer. The car stopped, and the officer got out. Shortly, there came a knock at the door. "Hello, Rocky," Muggsy greeted the officer. Rocky surveyed the plans, gave them a few more ideas on how to break into the bank, and wished them luck. "There's $5,000 in it for you if this works," Muggsy promised him. Their work paid off handsomely soon after, and sure enough, Muggsy gave Rocky the $5,000. But no crime was committed. Explain.
Muggsy gave... Rocky is the police officer?
Yes.
So they gave $5,000 to the police officer?
Yes.
They gave All right. These are all human beings.
These are all human beings, yes.
And they're planning to break into a bank, so it would seem. Is that
a question?
Are they planning to break into a bank?
No.
Are they... See, I was thinking they were being paid to test the soundness of a bank's defenses. Is that what's happening?
No. That's a good guess, though.
No, but see, then they wouldn't pay the cop. He would pay them. All right. Okay, so they're examining a bank's defenses. Can we say that?
Okay.
By bank, we mean an institution that holds money for people?
Yes.
Okay. And, okay. So they're... But you say they don't actually rob the bank.
That is correct.
Do they rob any bank?
No.
No crime is committed?
Correct.
Do I need to know... Are they criminals?
No.
In any way?
No.
See, I don't get... All right, so I missed the point where they pay Rocky eventually $5,000?
They do.
Let's look at that. He's a police officer.
Yes.
And he's aware of what they're doing.
Yes.
Can you give me the dialogue in the description again?
Hello, Rocky. Muggsy greeted the officer. Rocky surveyed the plans, gave them a few more ideas on how to break into the bank, and wished them luck. There's $5,000 in it for you if this works, Muggsy promised him.
If this works, and that doesn't refer to a break-in.
Correct.
Do we need to know their occupations?
Yes.
Is this fiction? Is it like a movie or something?
Yes.
Oh, thank God for that. I was really stumped otherwise. Is the whole thing fiction? Is it all just a scene in a movie? That still doesn't explain it.
No, it's not.
Okay, so Rocky is a police officer.
Yes.
In real life.
In real life.
The other two are actors?
No.
All right. This is a movie, though.
No. I didn't say it was a movie. I said it was fiction.
It's fiction. All right.
Yes.
Okay, what's fiction? Is the dialogue fiction?
No.
Is the whole scene fiction?
No.
The break-in is fiction?
Yes.
They're planning... Are they writers?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, they're planning to write... Well, I'm still not there yet. I haven't...
Oh.
They're planning to write a screenplay or a novel or something.
Yes.
About a break into a bank.
Yes.
But I don't understand why they're paying the cop, because he's a consultant.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. He basically looks over their plans and helps them come up with more ideas. It says how to break into the bank. And then they tell him that they'll pay him if it succeeds, if their novel that they're writing succeeds.
Okay.
So they pay him for his ideas on doing that.
That's good.
Yay. So good for you. And if anyone else has a puzzle they'd like to send in for us to use, you can send it to us at podcast@futilitycloset.com. That's another episode for us. If you're looking for more Futility Closet, you can check out our books on Amazon, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or visit the website at futilitycloset.com, where you can sample over 8,000 beguiling tidbits. At the website, you can also see the show notes for the podcast and listen to previous episodes. Just click Podcast in the sidebar. If you'd like to support Futility Closet, please consider becoming a patron to help keep us going. You can find more information at patreon.com/futilitycloset. You can also help us out by telling your friends about us or by clicking the donate button on the sidebar of the website. If you have 5 minutes, please take our survey at podsurvey.com/futility to help us find advertisers to support the show. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can reach us by email at podcast@futilitycloset.com. Our music was written and produced by Doug Ross. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.